I work as a nurse at a hospital in the UK that was initially constructed during World War II and was supposed to be a temporary facility. However, that was not the case, and it was further built upon and still remains as a slightly modernized hospital building. I recall doing a night shift during the wintertime and having a patient admitted to us with an infection but otherwise no illnesses that could affect their cognitive function. At around 2 or 3 a.m., said patient began to scream from the side room that they were placed in. I and another nurse responded. Once in the room, I tried to defuse the situation and calm the patient down. All the while, the patient was screaming about how a man with a bag over his head had been standing at the end of the bed watching her. As we entered the room, I could tell something was off and felt a shift in energy, despite myself telling the patient that there was nothing to be concerned about. Once settled, myself and the other nurse that came in with me had turned to leave the room and witnessed what I could only describe as a shadowy figure pass through the set of double doors outside the side room in which the patient resided. The doors are behind a bit of an alcove, so you can't see them from the side room, but once you leave the room, you can see them. After a few seconds, both the responding nurse and I clicked onto the fact that the double doors are always locked and must be unlocked with keys. The time it took for us to see the figure pass through that area, and how long it would take to unlock said doors, passing through them and unlock them again from the other side would be nearly impossible. Therefore, we both came to the conclusion that it was a ghost or entity of some sort, and returned to the desk somewhat unnerved. The hospital I work at has had its share of ghost stories, and this is one of 3 experiences I have had personally during my 5-year stay with this hospital in particular. This isn't really my story, as much as it is a second-hand, but I still feel inclined to share. There's a house that's an old farmhouse that's over 100 years old. It belonged to my ex-boyfriend's sister, which we visited a few times while we were still together. The property had been in their family for a few generations. When we visited, the owners would often talk about a spirit that lived in the house, particularly in the basement. They believed it to be an old farmhand that died on the property while the grandparents owned it. I believe he died being crushed by a tractor. A black aberration had been spotted in the basement a few times, usually in a rocking chair, sometimes wielding a shotgun or shovel. This was typical of this farmhand while he was alive, which is why they think it's him. The owners that live on the property don't believe the spirit is malicious or even indifferent, but rather is there to guard or protect the property. They've had unexplainable things happen, some of which they had on video. They showed me one of the noises from upstairs while they were home alone. It sounded like a golf ball being dropped, then rolled around repeatedly for about an hour. They went upstairs to investigate, but couldn't find anything that would make that noise. And by the way, they didn't have any indoor pets, and their children weren't home. The ex-boyfriend who grew up in the house would not go into the basement. He claims he never saw anything, but his sister said otherwise. We would try to coax him into the basement every time we were over there, but he always had some excuse not to go. His sister said that he and a friend went down when they were teenagers and saw a black figure, and never went down there again. The owners feel the spirit guard the property because they never have problems with wild animals or poachers on their farm, even though neighboring farms often do. The man who died apparently loved working on the farm and the farm owners, and would protect the property while he was still alive. They said they've never felt unsafe or unwelcome in their home. They had a few other stories as well, but I don't quite remember. Sorry if this wasn't more interesting. Just remembered this while watching some paranormal videos on YouTube and wanted to share. Edit. I remembered another story as well. While the sister was pregnant, she said she was home alone and went to walk downstairs from the second to first floor. She tripped and started to fall, when she suddenly felt something grab her to keep her upright. When I was 16, 39 now, my stepdad died of lung cancer in the house I lived in. It was a very sad process as he did not want to die. He never accepted his fate while he was alive. Towards the end, he was so high on meds, he didn't have any grasp of reality. The reason I mention that fact is that I believe when he died, he never quite realized he was dead. Now, the happenings after his passing. My mom took a second job, and I was home alone a lot. During this time, I would hang out in the basement most of my time there. I would hear footsteps walking from their room to the kitchen and would think my mom was home. I would head upstairs, but nobody was there. The cabinet doors would often be open and sometimes the light would be turned on that I knew were off. I had a very vivid dream where he was telling me about how much better he's feeling and how his hair is growing back, even on his feet. As I woke up from this dream, I was basically convulsing and making this bizarre snorting sound. That's when I saw him walking out of my room. I had friends over for some drinking and card playing. I decided to go to sleep upstairs in my room, and 3 of my friends were sleeping in the basement. I was woken up by them in my room, with them asking me, "How did you do that?" Totally confused, I had no idea what they were talking about. They told me the basement lights were flickering and a radio turned on with song lyrics playing something along the lines of, "This is my house." They were convinced I was playing some elaborate prank. I wasn't. The footsteps and cabinet doors instances would continue, and I became accustomed to hearing noises coming from their room where he died. In that room, I would hear noises that sounded like someone going through their things or just moving around. The last time I ever experienced anything from him was the strangest experience of all. I was home alone again, this time in the upstairs living room, which was right by their bedroom. The bedroom door was open and I was on the couch watching TV. I started to think I heard something, so I muted the volume and listened. What I heard was very distinct and unmistakable breathing coming from the room. It was distressed and progressively getting louder. I yelled out, "Okay, I hear you. I know you're here. Please stop haunting me. If you want to communicate, visit me in my dreams." The breathing immediately stopped and just sunk as far into the couch as possible and tried to continue to watch TV. Well, my mom really didn't know how to deal with his death. This was her soulmate and she was completely destroyed. She started seeing a guy she worked with soon after. Probably needed comfort or something, I couldn't understand then. Whatever the case, he was over at the house spending time about a month after his death. Whenever he was over, I could feel my stepdad. The best way to describe it, I could just feel his energy, and he wasn't happy. That night, I heard the breathing and told him to communicate with me in my dreams. I had a dream that night about my mom and her new boyfriend. They were hugging each other, and then my stepdad came out storming out of their room chasing the guy out of the house. What I took away from that was that he didn't want this man near my mom. And come to find out, he was married, and it ended up being a ridiculous situation. Since that night I told him to stop, I never experienced anything else in that house. My mother would see him where she worked often out of the corner of her eye, or she would smell him. One day she called me freaking out saying, "I saw him, I saw him." I turned the corner and he was there, standing at the aisle looking right at me. He still looked sick and very sad. She said he was a full body apparition and was visible for about 5 seconds. It was long enough for her to say, "I see you, I see you." This was the last time she or I had contact with him. That might have been the final goodbye. He was a great man. I miss him dearly. This instance occurred in northern Michigan at an old hunting cabin that my dad and uncles leased for about 5 years. The cabin belonged to an old couple before they started leasing it. The husband passed away and the wife decided to put it on the market. It was about 300 acres of land in the middle of absolute nowhere. This was a pretty large home with 5 rooms that had at least 2 twin beds in each room, with the exception of the couple's bedroom, which was always locked. This was kind of creepy, but I never thought anything of it. The house was still furnished with all their belongings as well. There was one main living room with a tiny little TV that got one Canadian station that would air the Red Green Show. This trip in particular was my dad, myself, and my brother. They decided to go to sleep, and I stayed up to watch that goofy Red Green Show. The important fact was that all the windows were closed and the heat was off, with no possibility of a breeze or wind blowing in from any window or any air vent. On the wall by the TV, there was a hat that belonged to the husband who, as mentioned before, was deceased. As I was watching the show, that hat began to wobble, and once I noticed it move, the hat levitated off the wall horizontally and floated to the chair that was below it. I mean that in every sense of the word. It floated slowly down from the chair. I immediately turned the TV off and hauled my ass to bed. My dad and brother were fast asleep, and my bed was right next to a window. As I lay there, totally confused and freaked out, I had this very eerie feeling that made me look out the window. This window faced the backyard, and when I looked, I saw a very unmistakable white apparition floating or gliding across the backyard. This made me roll back over and cover my head with my sleeping bag until I eventually fell asleep. I tried to find a logical explanation for the hat, but it was impossible. If you can imagine a cowboy-style hat removing itself from a wall fixture and float down to a chair in a very slow and deliberate manner, that's exactly what happened. I never sensed any malice or negativity, but it was the damnedest experience I ever had. In the early 2000s, I spent a lot of time at one of my best friend's houses. We would call him Kurt. We would work out in his basement, garage, and hang out on the bungalow-style second floor. There were about 5 of us who would regularly hang out there. One weekend, Kurt was out of town and gave us the green light to go work out in his basement. While my buddy Mike and I were starting to rotate on the heavy bag and jump rope, we both had this strange feeling of being watched, and the energy in the room became very dense and thick. It all seemed to be coming from this corner of the room. We both acknowledged how weird it felt, but we continued. This lasted about 2 minutes before both our arms started to burn on the exact same spots right above our elbows. We both had these large red areas that were absolutely on fire. Nothing made any sense because we didn't have anything come into contact with them. We immediately left the house and as soon as we did, our arms returned to normal. The redness was gone, and the burning sensation subsided. There was a second occurrence back at Kurt's house, with a couple of us hanging out with him and his 4-year-old daughter. Kurt had to run to pick up his wife, and we were babysitting while he took off. We all were on the second floor hanging out and playing games with his kid. She randomly got up and walked downstairs without saying anything. My buddy Mike and I didn't really think anything of it until we heard her talking to someone, and it sounded like she was answering questions. I got up to go look over the railing that was above the stairs to see if I could spot her. It sounded like she was still at the bottom of the stairs. That's when I saw a very distinct football-sized white orb floating up the stairs. And as I was watching this thing totally shocked, it ascended rapidly, made a 90-degree turn, and went right through my leg. As this happened, I reactively tried to jump out of the way, but couldn't avoid it. I immediately turned to my buddy Mike and asked, "Did you see that?" He looked hilariously confused, and the expression, "You look how I feel," came out. We couldn't believe what the hell had just happened. My leg felt strange and warm, but not painful at all. We came downstairs and waited for Kirk to get back. As soon as he did, we told the story and talked about the burning arms incident. He was dumbfounded and told us he had never experienced anything like that in the house. I was wondering if it never presented itself to him, or was Kirk just blind to it all. After that, we were never there without Kurt again and never experienced anything else. Both occasions were very strange, to say the least.